Okay, it's a go. Great. Can everybody hear me all right? Great. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I know it is the week before the holidays. It's rainy and dark, but we are so happy that you're here. This is our last artist talk in the Innovation Studio for 2024, which is amazing. So if you've been coming to these, thank you for supporting. My name is Amanda Jiron-Murphy, and I work at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Arlington. I run a residency program, and I'm a curator. And tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce all of you to Hoesy Corona, who's been the last artist in residence here at the Innovation Studio. And we're really lucky to be working with you. I mean, I know that we'll talk about this during the conversation, but it just feels like the world is opening up to you in so many ways in your creative practice. So to give you all a sense of this, I'm going to go ahead and read Hoesy's bio, which might be a little awkward because it's long and it's impressive. But just to give you a sense of what Hoesy has done. Hoesy Corona is a Latinx queer artist creating uncategorized and multidisciplinary art spanning installation, performance, and sculpture. In the studio, Hoesy's work highlights the complex relationship between humans and the environment by focusing on our changing climate and its impact on habitation and migration patterns, while bringing attention to the lush flora and multitudinous powers of nature, which I think you can see evidence of in the work behind me and what we're going to be talking about tonight. I'm going to skip ahead here. Corona has exhibited widely in galleries, museums, and public spaces in the United States and internationally, including solo exhibitions, Climactic Shocks at Praxis New York and Manhattan, Weathering in 2022 at the Krieger Museum, presented by the Nicholson Project, the Walters Museum in Baltimore, and Alien Nation 2017 at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, presented by Transformer in DC. So we'll also be talking about that Hirshhorn performance because it seems like it was a very important moment in your career. And then the list goes on and on. You received the Andy Warhol Foundation's Grit Fund grant, a Ruby's Artist grant. You participated in the Halcyon Arts Lab Fellowship in Washington, D.C. Oh my goodness. George Kaiser Family Foundation Arts Fellowship in 2019 and 2020 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And you were a Restoring Trust artist in residence at the 2023 at Wabash College in Crawfordsville, Indiana. You've done the Oxbow residency. I mean, your credentials are really quite special, and I look forward to hearing we'll talk a little bit more hopefully about what's on the horizon for you. So that is Hoesy in a nutshell. But what I really hope that we can accomplish tonight is give a sense to people who aren't familiar with you about the evolution of your work and how what you've done here at this residency kind of sits within your larger practice of costuming, performance wearables, and performance in general. But before we get there, we're going to go chronologically. Could you tell us a little bit about the origins of your creative life? Like, how did you become an artist, and how did you begin this journey in making art?
Oh, the question, right?
The question.
Yeah. And I think that obviously every artist has a different answer, but I think most can relate to maybe always being around materials, right? I think most kids at that time are familiar with pencils, with crayons, like it's the very rudimentary materials. So that has always been in my memory, right? Ever since I can remember. Also working with clay, whether it was, finding something in the land that was clay-like, right? So like it wasn't dirt, but something that was clayish material. And making sculpture with it, then shifting to plastiline, which is used by architects because it never gets hard. So like creating something and then smashing it and creating something else. And so that's maybe 4 or 5 years old, and I kind of remember these things, right? But knowing that something was slightly different in that I would make a little dog, and the other kids were like, oh, make me a dog too. And so you start realizing like, okay, but why don't you just make yourself that little creature? So slowly you start realizing there's something different, right? Because people seem to respond to it. If I skip a couple years later to like middle school or high school, then it was about, oh, can I give you $5 and you draw me a rose for like my crush? You know what I mean? And you're like, okay, so there's something happening here, right? Like apparently these are skills. Clearly back then, even the confidence was like not there as an artist, right, to claim it. So sometimes I didn't know how to respond because I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if you're gonna be happy with what I end up producing, right? But yes, art was always very much around. And then thinking about my family, nobody in the family considers themselves an artist. But if I think back, and we were just having earlier conversations with some guests, like um, everybody was always embroidering. People were always knitting. People were, for weddings, they would be making paper, cut paper decorations or tissue paper flowers. So very crafty, very artsy, right? But again, it takes that courage to claim it and be like, I'm an artist. So nobody in my immediate family took that plunge. So they're crafty people, for lack of better words, right? And I'm like, you're artist, just claim it. So they were always encouraging in that way. So I never felt, encumbered by, oh my God, I need to go out and be a certain profession or, something like that. So they were always very encouraging, but it wasn't until actually high school. So somebody does have to, hello.
Hello.
Somebody does have to, invite you in to that realm. Um, an early on professor showed me books, like individual artist books, and they were like, oh, this is so and so artist, and this is their practice. I couldn't compute, right? I'm like, what do you mean? Like, this is their career? And so even that becomes, a new understanding of, oh my God, so this is a real thing. You can make a living from it. Or so I thought, right? I mean, it's very difficult. But so you can make a living, you can make it your career, and slowly the little world starts being filled in. So how do they make a career? Oh, well, they have a thing called a studio. Oh, well, how do they show their exhibits? Oh, well, there's these curator types, right? Or there's collectors who support their practice. So all of those blanks started to get filled in, and I feel like that transitioned my own thinking into really seeing it as a viable possibility for the future, right? That in the world, my contribution was going to be through the arts, right? And that's like a big moment to have, because I think that as a young person, you do want to contribute to the world, right? You're young, people don't understand you. The story is the same for everybody. But again, realizing this is a way that I can communicate, I'm good at it, and I'm very much in control. So that was the beginning, and then that led me to art school and continue this further.
So I think some people might be surprised, or maybe not, to learn that you studied painting initially.
Yes.
So could you talk a little bit about that transition from painting to the next chapters in your career?
So I think that a lot of folks, especially being here at the Innovation Studio, a lot of a diverse community of people come in here, and oftentimes the association with artist or art is whether you can draw or you can't, right? And so I think that I definitely fell in line early on. And also I just loved painting. I mean, what a beautiful introduction to the arts. So very much owned it, claimed it. And then the little bit of art history that I started, confronting myself with, painters were the most celebrated, right? Historically, it was the epitome of the arts, like even above sculptors, right? It's like, no, painting is the thing that you want to accomplish. So I drank the Kool-Aid because that was what was being celebrated. So I ended up continuing this all the way through college. So I went to the Maryland Institute College of Art for a degree in painting, but quickly I realized that I was creating large-scale canvas paintings and then removing them from the stretchers, and then maybe getting my studio mate next door to stand there while I threw the canvas over their body. So I'm not necessarily thinking about installation or performance. It was just something about the still image on a wall, on the canvas, on whatever material. The illusion wasn't cutting it, right? Like there was something more that I needed. So started ripping the paintings, like all these big no-nos that you're not supposed to do, stapling them to create a floor as opposed to like putting them on the wall, wrapping them up in a bundle and over a stool. So suddenly it's this, form. And again, without knowing the language around the variety of practices that could emerge out of painting, luckily there was, introductory class in college that purposefully for the first year paired you with a diverse group of majors. So you were next to the sculptors, next to the fiber artists, the ceramic artists, the video artists, and you were in the same class, elements of visual thinking, and producing work in a variety of media. So it just kind of like came into place. I was like, oh, it's the same idea within a painting. It's just clearly new constraints. Now you're dealing with physical objects. Now you're dealing with an installation that is temporary. So it was nice to explore that. However, having drank the Kool-Aid, I was still like, no, I am clearly still a painter because I am not going to step down from the top. Hello, painting. Right? So that was so ingrained. And it's funny because at a certain point, professors started noticing what I was doing. So they would push me or point me towards maybe an interdisciplinary sculpture practice, which was a major, or even fiber arts, right? Because they were more experimental in the way that I was creating this work. Again, I almost felt offended, right? I'm like, how dare you? Like, you want me, like, I didn't know how to process that, right? Because painting was the epitome, again, of the arts. And I knew this to be true because as sophomores, we already had studio spaces, and sculpture students didn't have one. Printmaking students didn't have one. So we were getting different privileges, right? Just by being a painting major. So I knew that it was still true, you know? So I stuck with painting, but clearly the work kind of started becoming my work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want me to talk a little bit about after leaving that
Well,
practice?
yeah, so of course, full disclosure, we sort of scripted this out yesterday, and you told a wonderful story about the 4,000 square foot warehouse space and how that was the origins of your performance work.
Right.
So could you tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, and right on time, right? So yes, that's the college experience, right? Being very serious about it. I think how I started that conversation was that you really need a community, right, as artists. And especially when you're leaving college, I didn't know this then, but you're leaving and you're thinking, oh my God, this is the real world. Like, there's so many creative people all around you. People are eager to engage with abstract ideas, think very deeply about issues in the world or, concepts in the artwork. And then you realize that we are thrown out across the world, really, and we are few and far between once we're out of that scenario. So luckily for me, and as the universe would have it, a core group of friends, we were just so cool and tight with each other that we ended up renting, well, we already had the warehouse space, a warehouse space in Baltimore that was very industrial, very raw, 4,000 square feet. And I think that a lot of folks here or out in the world, through the interwebs, will kind of relate that when you are just starting out as an artist, you either choose to wait around and quote unquote be discovered, or you start making movement yourself. And being very intuitive, I knew that I should not be waiting around to be discovered by anything because nobody was coming, right? Nobody's gonna come. So luckily, having that community of friends, we kind of inspired each other, and having access to a raw warehouse space, we decided to come together and we created the Copycat Theater. The warehouse space was called the Copycat Building, so we became the Copycat Theater. We're not a theater, we are artists, right? And we are entering this from kind of the point of view of performance art. So every month we decided to stage a gathering. And so we would invite all types of live performances, not just performance art. So at one point there was like a belly dancer on the lineup, a rock band, all kinds of artists that were doing liveness, right? Something that was live. And sometimes the lineup was like, 20 people. So these were long affairs in a warehouse space with no air conditioning. But we had consistently 200 people show up. So every single month, we knew that we ourselves were putting on an exhibit of sorts. So every single month, I had the opportunity for 2 years to come up with a performance. And that's where my language, my vocabulary around performance art started to develop. I needed those opportunities. And again, if I had chosen to quote unquote wait around, that might have taken decades, right? To get, let's say 24 opportunities to stumble, to fall down, to figure things out. Well, it happened in a condensed timeline. So yeah, every month I would spend the whole month working on materials. After you leave painting of sorts, how do you get a red? Where am I supposed to dig a blue, right? It's like, I understood that I had materials, they come in a little tube, and they're at my fingertips, right? And I mix them and I create. Suddenly I had to think outside the box. If I wanted to use a red, I needed to go out into the world and find it. Luckily, at the same time, I was finishing my job at at a grocery store. Right, at a grocery. That's how I put myself through college, and I started paying attention to the materials in a new way. So every bouquet comes, with a piece of cellophane. Sometimes the slightly higher priced ones have a piece of chiffon or a piece of organza or some kind of material. Well, the clear cellophane was always clear, but the organza was sometimes a light pink, sometimes a deep blue. So I just started, consciously holding on to both the cellophane and the organza and anything that drew me in. And after accumulating materials, that's where I would draw my red, my blue, my orange. But again, then I used this material leading up to the performance that month. So I started creating a lot of wearable sculptures. I wanted to obfuscate the body. At first, to be honest, because I was petrified, I was like, I'm a painter. What am I gonna be doing speaking to an audience, right? So there was, these were strategies, I guess, to kind of gain that confidence. So sometimes it took a little half mask. Other times it was a little bit of a wig. Other times it was an overwhelming headdress that gave me enough hiding spots to really deliver the performance. So that's when I started gaining the language around, okay, this is now a new trajectory. I am no longer holding on to the mini handbook that maybe art school gives you. Suddenly I was navigating this new realm by myself, right? Quickly realizing, wait, a painting is there, you can photograph it at a certain point. I had to quickly realize that these ephemeral moments were gone, right? And whoever was present witnessed it, otherwise it was gone forever. So I really early on started realizing that documentation was gonna be key because visual was gonna reach more people than the ephemeral performance. So I immediately started then shifting mindsets, right? The photos couldn't be just whatever. I was seeking an iconic image from that performance, something I didn't need, although I took way too many photos, I was always after one or two that would be a stand-in for the thing. And so I then started developing a series called The Nobodies, which really emerged out of again, engaging in performance art.
So actually, this is a perfect place, unless they've already been cued. We have images for those of you who are tuning in online from these early performances, and you'll see a couple of them appearing here on the screen. So could you talk a little bit about some of the earliest performance works I have here written? The Nobodies, Mother, Death, Life, MoMA, The White Constructions, and Scapegoats?
Yeah, and so The Nobodies was a natural kind of progression of obfuscating the body. I think around this same time, really, and through college, becoming politicized, you know what I mean, as a human existing in the world. So really starting to think about that. And suddenly, having quote unquote left, even though I really never left it, but quote unquote having left painting, I was leaving the illusion that you create as a painter and moving into the realities of a performance, In painting, here I was creating a beautiful illusion of the apple. Over in the performance, here's the apple. Is it red or green? You have to make a choice, right? What are you dealing with? So a lot of the content of these new works became more engaged with the world, right? With what was happening, understanding power structures, understanding who's visible, who's not visible. And so these things started informing the visuals. So I was like, oh my God, the obfuscated body. Okay, a series is emerging here. So quickly I honed in on the idea of nobodies, right? Those who are kind of disregarded in our society, whose opinion we care about the least. And this is not coming out of nowhere. I mentioned working at a grocery store. Well, I had to be there very early, so I would sometimes walk to work. And there's a lot of homelessness in Baltimore. So encountering these daily visuals at the crack of dawn, I feel started informing me, right? And even the way we navigate spaces, public spaces like that, we avert our eyes, we pretend that we ourselves are invisible. Oh, I don't see you, therefore you're invisible. So we all are, in one way or another, enacting a type of nobodying, right? Clearly, it's a human being, it's a person, it's a somebody, but we are engaging in the process of making somebody nobody. And so I was like, you know what? This is what the work is dealing with. Subconsciously, it was emerging. And I think that's something important to even mention, that sometimes the work is created before the real work is created. Other times the work is created and it tells you what's happening. So again, having those 24 times to produce performances I wasn't necessarily thinking, I'm creating a new series called The Nobodies, right? But it emerges. So yeah, so there I just obfuscated the body a lot more, thought about it in the same way that culture is consumed by the masses, that we, consume the visual experience, the edible experience, the sound experience, all kinds of culture, right? So here I was making the body hyper visible. It's colorful, sometimes shiny, sometimes with a lot of movement, but the person, again, was removed. So I was thinking about how, again, we consume the tacos, the burritos, but maybe we don't care so much about the people behind those tacos or burritos, you know? So I think that this was manifesting that, right? And thinking, well, at the time, it was this contentious relationship with Mexican Americans, but you see that things seem to keep emerging, right? It's like cycles. But yeah, so that was the original series. And then through that, other series start to emerge. So the scapegoats, for instance, I honed in on the archetype of the scapegoat around, themes of blame, shame, who is that in society. I kind of tied it to queerness. So the scapegoat originally, it has biblical beginnings. This presumably a goat, right? A scapegoat is doused in blood and then cast off into the wilderness with everyone's sins on it, presumably to die, right? And so when I started thinking about that and then attaching the idea of queerness, I was like, ooh, that sounds horrible, right? Like people who are cast away in our society. But what if they are cast away to quote unquote perish and die? But what if they don't die, right? What if they're able to finagle their way through the margins of the jungle of society and suddenly outside of the center where you have to follow the rules, there's, a way of performing and enacting in society. Well, guess what? You've been cast away. You were cast off to die. You didn't die. Now you're surviving. Maybe you encounter others that were discarded in society. And there's a lot of power in the margins, right? It's like, oh, okay, yes, it's horrible because you're cast away, but then nobody's paying attention. So you can create your own culture. You can create your own, your own reality, your own world. So at first they started as small wire sculptures. They transformed to chair forms that have, then I, created sculptures on top of them thinking about our comfort at whose expense. And then they transform into small ceramic objects, like 500 of them, that I called scapegoat idols, thinking, okay, how might we rid ourselves of these kinds of blame and shame? And so these scapegoat idols almost worked as talisman, that you would hold them daily, and you want to blame the Mexicans, those damn Mexicans stealing our goddamn jobs, and that may be the nasty thing that we have within us. Well, guess what? Maybe hold on to this scapegoat idol and voice it, but let it be cast away into this talisman, right? So that maybe you rid yourself of those things and are not necessarily burying them.
Interesting.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Again, that's it. That's the series that was emerging. Then it became very much also a performative series, and I started transforming them away from the sculptures into more like deities. So instead of seeing them as these poor little things, poor little scapegoats blamed for everything, suddenly they're a little bit more in power and in control, right? It's like maybe they're worthy of devotion. Yeah.
And in these early performances, was it always you that was cast in? You were wearing these wearables?
Yeah.
Or? Okay.
And so at the beginning, it was always me. I mean, I had no other way to even conceive of them. I thought, oh my God, in the studio as a painter, it's you doing the thing. Well, not always, but it's you doing the thing. And so at first it was always me. And also I didn't know how to communicate to others, how to do the thing, right? You asking that makes me think about when I was doing the performances, it was just, they had to be done, but they were very overwhelming. They were taxing on the body. I'm talking about cellophane. Well, being in cellophane for a long time, you're pouring sweat, you're uncomfortable. So all these things, or in a future body of work that relates to this, I'm having myself with arms extended, and I later came to realize that's a torture pose, right? The human can't hold their arms straight out for too long, but I would do it, right? It was about duration. It would be 60 minutes in, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm about to collapse. And so again, just dealing with these things myself, slowly when I started expanding to others, that's when I was confronted with the fact that, oh my God, that's uncomfortable, or you can't make somebody wear this 20-pound headdress, right? It's like, oh, so then negotiating how to work with people
Right.
outside of myself. Yeah.
So speaking of which, it sounds like one of this major shifts for you, a major opportunity, was the Hirshhorn performance.
Yes.
So could you talk a little bit about the Hirshhorn performance and how that became the origins of the climate ponchos?
Yeah, so in 2017, I had the opportunity to work with Transformer DC, a small arts organization. Well, not small, really. They have a small gallery space, but they're a big arts organization. They work a lot with contemporary artists, specifically emerging. So they're always after, the emerging artists, like the weird thing that's bubbling that may not have a sustainable market yet, but they're willing to kind of champion these artists. I felt so, lucky to come in contact with them at a conference, and I did a small group show with them, and then Victoria, who's the director, invited me to craft a large-scale performance, 24 people at the Hirshhorn Museum. And so the Hirshhorn is very unique, as you all know, donut-shaped with the donut hole missing. So I had the second floor windows, which were 24, for me to activate with shadows and performers. So I decided that it would be perfect to really think about all the wearables that I had been developing and have them all come together. So when we were, putting it together and we did a little run through, lo and behold, I was missing five windows, right? And so I went back to the studio, produced some work, and that was the first time that the climate ponchos, which are these shapes behind me or next to me, started to emerge. As an artist, sometimes, like I said, you come up with the idea and it develops organic or naturally. Sometimes you are doing something else, and if you are paying close attention, you realize that something is emerging and it starts to inform you. So when I looked at the documentation, I realized that a new series had emerged, but it made so much sense because when I got this opportunity at the Hirshhorn, I went in, started really paying attention to the architecture, right? I wanted to think about what to do there. So started thinking like the idea of something circular, something with cycles, something, cyclical, seasons, days, time, like, okay, what am I thinking through? That performance ended up being titled Alien Nation, and the performers did beautiful shadow castings up there. We were working with live musicians down below. 1,200 people showed up. And then slowly, small groups of 4 and 5 performers were disappearing without you knowing it and making their way downstairs. So then in some of the pictures, you'll see that people are encircling a performer. So then they're suddenly down here with the masses. And before you knew it, all of them gathered and kind of got together and continued on their procession. So that's where this series really emerged, the Climate Immigrant series that I have. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about how, I realize the performances have evolved, but so has this language around climate migration and the wearables as a form of protection. Can you talk a little bit about how those themes have entered your work now and even how they're presenting themselves, say, on the wall behind us?
Yeah, and you know what? I think that, something happens, I guess, the more you do, you kind of like practice art and then you become, I guess, like without even wanting to, you become a little institutionalized, working with institutions, you start to like, things start kind of like sticking to you, whether it's like censoring your language or like the kind of work you produce. All of these things just happen, but it's, sometimes it's just practical to like get something up. Other times it feels like it's maybe more digestible, So I do realize that like the performance aspect or sometimes even the site-specific works have a little bit more of a punch to them. But really what I was thinking through these ideas, I didn't necessarily want to alienate people with such a kind of contentious topic in our country anyway. So I created, I wanted to hone in on the archetype of the traveler. So not necessarily any one particular traveler, but just the traveler. So it could be somebody at the park, somebody at the airport, somebody crossing a border, right? It could be this expansive way of looking at it as a way to think about the way we negotiate space, who belongs, who doesn't. I always keep my figures anonymous, and so really thinking about allowing space for the viewer to be able to project their own narratives onto the work. And again, this is for me creating a lot of entry points into the work. But yeah, so slowly, I mean, I just started developing and kind of like refining itself in this way.
And I know that you mentioned also that COVID, although a limitation, also presented itself with opportunities for you in terms of how you were photographing, documenting the work, and then that provided material for even the things that we see behind us here. Can you talk a little about that?
And so you know what, again, artists and limitations, I feel like that's just the nature of artists. We're like problem solvers. So, and again, everybody has their own story about how they shifted their practice during the pandemic. But for me, I was actually doing a long-term residency or fellowship in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so, you know, we had beautiful studios provided for us, and it was a great, you know, space, and things were happening. With the pandemic, we had limited hours, or no hours sometimes. So I started thinking outside the box. So I ended up hiring a single performer, you know, that we could be masked. And I started photographing them against a green background, right, to be able to like digitally manipulate them. And so before I knew it, I had all kinds of material that was digital, that is not what I was used to. But I ended up buying tights, body tights for the performer. And without realizing it, I realized that the silhouettes I was working with were now being kind of like plucked and manifested in the real world. So that ended up giving me another dimension to the performances. They started by just wearing the ponchos, and quickly I realized, oh my God, now there can be, you know, a new element to those performances. But yeah, so after doing all of these digital manipulations, I realized I had way too much digital material without necessarily knowing what to do with it, because I was not working with that, you know, material or technology. But it opened up the opportunity for, what do you do with a bunch of digital files? And so, you know, I've printed them on sheer fabric. I've worked with, you know, jacquard weaving. Jacquard weaving is the precursor to computers. That's where like the pixel comes from. So it's, you know, a loom and it's woven. Now it's all digitized. So you can get very amazing images that near like photoreal. I mean, they look pretty realistic, but obviously it's all made of threads. So, you know, collaborating with these kinds of productions. Now really thinking about the future even of this series, getting them in acrylic or cut stainless steel. So really just working through materials as the series continues to evolve. And now that it became also more sculptural or more visual, that it's not just limited to the wearables during the performance, I also have supplemental artworks that, yeah, supplemental is a good word, because I feel like it's the stand-in for the liveness of the performance or the ephemerality of the installation. So even right behind me, this is a wall collage, right? So here I was working with a historic library, and I couldn't even put a push pin on the wall. So I had to come up with solutions that wouldn't ruin the wall, but it also gives me amazing new opportunities moving forward. But if you notice, it's not far-fetched, it's not random. It's like, oh, I'm already collaging on these materials. I'm already thinking in that way. So suddenly it's just larger and on the wall.
And there's a real theatricality the way that you use the space. It feels anyway in this space as though you've created a stage set where there's this narrative that's taking place.
And you know what? And that's been slowly developing, because again, earlier on, it was very much about the performances. But with opportunities to work with museums or galleries, well, you do have the opportunity to deal with the walls, right? So even with this is only the second iteration of this new series. So happy. I mean, and we'll talk about that, but so happy to be here to have this beautiful wall, right? So imagine it's a random sketchbook page. It's just a beautiful, huge wall. Yeah. So at the original tryout, if you will, of this new material, I did have 3 performers, and so some performers in bodysuits, other wearing climate ponchos. But juxtaposed against these visuals, it created a depth that I was not used to. There was banners that were suspended. So it suddenly is creating relationships beyond the live performer. You're looking up at the ceiling, you're looking at the architecture.
It's funny because you started out as a painter, you got away from the wall, and now you're finding your way back to the wall.
And I will say that it's not also random. It makes it, but guess what? I also realized that I really was getting very, on paper, amazing opportunities. It's just that they were very temporary. Even the Hirshhorn, I mean, big deal, right? And I loved it and it was great, but it was also a one evening event, right? And I noticed that that was a consistent through line, that I was being invited to the Baltimore Museum of Art, and it was, for that little hour, and then you're done. And I wanted to kind of create or instigate the imaginations of viewers and curators and other people to imagine the work beyond just the live performance, both because I was interested in that, but also maybe it just gave me more of a sustainable future, right? Because when you do a performance, it may be as low as like, here's your $75 or here's your couple of $1,000. But I think that extending that to having objects that are supplemental to that creates a maybe more sustainable way of being an artist.
So you've got multiple things going on simultaneously. There's the performance leg of what you do, and then there's also the way these things exist within a gallery space, and sometimes they can intersect.
Yeah.
Can you talk maybe a little bit about, I think there's a couple of last images that we have, both of gallery installations, just to give people a sense of what these things look like in the space. Obviously, you're looking at these now. But then also the kinds of performances you've been invited to do where the wearables are taken out into nature.
Yeah, so I think that, going off from this idea of, okay, now working with these institutions and spaces, now having that vocabulary a little bit more set. So I'm always interested, again, like I said, to tie in that liveliness into other aspects of the space that I'm working with. But then, after the Hirshhorn, I've had several other opportunities where I get invited to different locations. For instance, last year, Tefra ICA in Reston, Virginia, had their 50th anniversary. So the Reston Community Association, in partnership with the ICA, commissioned me to do this large-scale performance of 24 performers. Similar number to the Hirshhorn, funny, but 24 performers. And so I took the opportunity to actually just hone in on two bodies of work, The Climate Immigrants and Mother, Death, Life, Mama, which I didn't talk about a lot about, but really thinking about our mortality, right? And that's kind of like, what I'll say about that. But so I had the 24 performers, and I divided them into 3 groups, some with ponchos, some with the bodysuits, and then some with these, I guess a new version of the poncho. It's just that it belongs to the Mother, Death, Life, Mama, where post-COVID, they're almost like oversized sweaters of sorts. And I honed in on the motif of the lungs, right? It was like such the thing that was giving up on people. So the lungs kind of like as a stand-in for that life and death moment. But again, there it was a festival setting. So, there's people in tents, like the artists. And so you're walking down city streets, right? So there's a lot of other visual information, signs, parking, no parking, an advertisement for this food or that food. That's one way to engage with that kind of opportunity. Another one was when the Kennedy Center opened their the satellite location, or sister location. The amazing artist Carrie Mae Weems curated a processional to inaugurate it. So they ended up closing a highway and multiple streets. So I did a processional, starting under a bypass and then continuing on through these city streets. Different experience. And the last one I'll mention is last year as well, working with the Academy Art Museum in Easton, Maryland. They partnered with the Atkins Arboretum. So suddenly, I had an exhibition at the museum, but we went to the Arboretum to create a performance against nature. To me, one of my favorite, simply because all those other visual, noise really was devoid of that. So it was just beautiful green, nature colors, and then these shiny ponchos and the iridescent colors really popping against that background.
Oh,
But everything is always site-specific, right? It's like dealing with what are the limitations, how are we gonna handle this? Obviously, that was an arboretum, so there's a lot of pathways. So we actually took the audience members in a preset pathway. So we process together, right? And so again, with these performances, I'm never thinking about entertaining people. It's more about paying witness to people existing in the world and negotiating how they navigate through it, right? So it's like a little bit more of a little poetic moment as opposed to thinking like, and you're gonna be so entertained and the dance is coming, I'm not interested. I'm just like, it's these human beings that are obfuscated, but their presence is felt because you're seeing them, you feel them.
Yeah, wow, fantastic. I am very sensitive to the fact that people probably have a bajillion questions for you, either online or in person. So I feel like we can open this up. Anybody have a question for Hoesy?
Yes.
So Thank you. If you had to pick between doing more like the collage work that you have expressed on the back wall here, or doing more of the performance pieces, do you just flow with the art wherever it takes you, or do you feel like you want to really do one over the other art form?
So you know what? I think that they're so intertwined that yeah, I feel like they're always. So even just yesterday, looking towards the future, nothing concrete, but you know, a future exhibition potentially. So now instead of just thinking through it as a performance, because there's a history now of additional elements, the conversation starts with that, right? So it's like, yes, the live performance is going to happen. How can we tie in, again, the architectural elements of the space? How can we activate the background? So even just as a background for us now, how lovely it creates that space for the performance to have a richness that maybe it wouldn't have with devoid of these additional visuals. So for me, I do a little bit go with the flow, but I'm always incorporating the various facets of the practice. Early on in my career, I always, I think it came from like post-structuralist theory, that I really embrace the idea of the things are always in a state of becoming, you know, that they're always emerging. And I think that it even goes back all the way to the painting, right? It was like, oh, let me remove it from the stretcher. It's still the same painting, but now it's gonna be over a body, right? So like, oh, it was a painting. Now it's apparently this wearable. Maybe that ends up being a piece in a collage, right? So things are always morphing, always evolving. But I think that the multidisciplinary aspect of it is what draws me in. Yeah. And it is also so much more just awesome to be engaging with all these like problems, which sounds horrible, but like problems to solve, right? It's like, ooh, it keeps you more engaged with contemporary materials, what's accessible. Like I mentioned earlier, really translating the materials into cut stainless steel, to plexis or acrylics. So that's slowly, you know, these are small works right now, but they're leading towards public installations. Like what about this entryway? What if this is a climate poncho in metal and you encounter it out in the world? Or at an airport, you encounter, you know, 100 acrylic, various color pieces suspended in the ceiling. So that hasn't manifested yet, but I have a feeling it will, you know? Blind trust there.
Actually, I don't know. I'm very sensitive also to the fact that we may not have fully explained the climate poncho concept. Like, can you talk a little bit more about what these ponchos, both what they represent, but also who they're meant to be worn by and why?
Yeah, well, you know, I think that the visuals that are depicted on the actual climate ponchos are a stand-in for the performance themselves. So, you know, they're very intricately tied, but yeah, well, I mean, just different
So
answers,
just like
in terms of.
the idea of climate migration and,
Oh
you
my
know.
God, we didn't.
We
Right.
didn't even
The
go
thing
there.
is that this is a little taste because guess what? We could go on for 2 hours.
Yeah, right.
So with this series, I really was honing in on this idea of the human aspect of climate change. Obviously, that conversation is active, but not so much the human aspect of it. And what does that mean? Well, we're talking about displacement. We're talking about just changing. Locales, like how are people dealing with droughts, with lack of resources, with changing resources, you know, whether it's a drought or it's too much water that's like creating flash floods. So really thinking through these ideas of the people, the human aspect of it. And then most recently, like having visited Mexico even, and there's a small town and they have this beautiful lagoon and there's obviously a lot of fishermen, there's a lot of industry that happens there. But when I was visiting, everybody was a little bit, you know, unsure what to do because the lagoon was pretty much empty. Instead of boats, the boats are at the bottom. There's horses grazing where the lagoon was. But it really made me think about also immigration at large, how we tie it to other things, whether it's like gang-related something or a different kind of poverty. Well, it's more and more also because of the changing climate, right? Like, what do you do if your industry is disappearing because there's a lack of water? So all of these things, but I think that also on top of it, it is a rudimentary form. So two pieces of something, right, that is able to cover the body, protect the body. So a rudimentary wearable that hints at protection from what? The atmosphere, our own world, right? But it also talks about travel, movement, displacement.
I also really like the way that some of the travelers are depicted carrying jugs of water and just that they have everything on their backs and necessary for wherever it is that they're going to go, to
Right.
collect what they need, to consume what they need, that kind of thing.
And you know what? And with that, yeah, that they're always carrying everything. Like I said earlier, they're always hidden. But I'm really thinking about that consciously in the way that dehumanization is weaponized to get away with like horrible things. Well, first we have to stop thinking of the people as people, right? To get away with keeping them in cages. And we're like, well, they're not people and they're illegal. Like, well, then they must deserve it, right? So like thinking through that, and actually some of the visuals where they're not hidden, those are drawn from newspaper clippings, right? So things that are very much available out in the world, the way we engage with others.
Great.
Yes.
Do you or do you intend to have any performance aspect to this show at the Innovation Studio?
So you know what? Because it is a limited time, I think that it's more of like the visual representation or these like ephemeral. But you know, I do think ever since the pandemic, I think when I started doing the photographs of these performers, I started really honing in on the idea of performance for the camera, which is clearly not my construction. It's been around. But this performance for the camera, so in many ways, I think this is a performance, right? It's just that it's not live, which is a little bit funny because performance is so tied to the liveness, but if it's for the camera, it was live when it was being taken. So I think that it might stay like this, but we're always talking about, oh my God, look at the beautiful park. Like, wouldn't it be a great place to activate? So, you know, stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
Right.
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Sitting here and listening, I'm thinking how interesting it would be in the sense of going to see a play, right? Where even for you, writing a play and going and seeing it, how separate does that echo to having the performance be something that happens that you kind of walk into afterwards? Like if you're not there as the artist performing and being a part of it. I guess I'm being confronted with two questions at the same time.
Okay.
Own head and it's jumbling together. I guess the first question would be, have you thought about maybe putting together a performance that could be presented by somebody else? And I guess the second out of that would be, I haven't formulated it yet.
Well, when it comes, but let me start with that one. I think that for sure, because I think that now, especially, and obviously, artist timelines are not regular human timelines, right? It's like some things might emerge like years later that were conceived, you know, in 2017. That's actually what I'm dealing with. The new series I'm not even talking about, that's been emerging is from 2017, and I'm like, weird. So, but even when I get these opportunities, I feel like, they inform me a little bit more and more, and I'm like, oh yes, I could see that happening. I'm not sure if, it would be an option, right? Like a more performing arts aligned kind of performance. I feel like I definitely never want to have the expectation of entertainment attached to it because it puts a different kind of pressure that I'm like, oh, that's not what I'm interested in. But those spaces are fabulous and they have so much like amazing technology and resources. And even local friends that are actually one of my friends put on a play and I'm like, oh, but you're a performance artist. And obviously it's not a conventional play. So yeah, I think that there is possibility for that. Even looking into future projects where there is, like I said, a gallery element. But again, the performance element with instructions, with a little bit of a run through, yes, it could happen, right? So, the way I envision it, if this is the installation, or this was all over, and then there were scheduled performers, so like 20 people showed up in bodysuits, and they activate the space right in between us. And so, it's almost like one of those guerrilla activations, but it's scheduled and it's already run through, but there's no beginning, middle, or end. Honestly, my favorite. And even when I started the earlier performance, I would always start like, if I was about to go on and it was my performance, I may start from the back with a loud knocking and it disturbs you and you're like, oh my God, somebody's knocking, somebody's locked out. And before you know it, you're in the middle of realizing, oh my God, the performance already started when the knocking started. I always appreciated like coming into the middle of something as opposed to like, oh, again, beginning, middle, and end, and it's resolved. Well, that's not close to the issues I'm dealing with, right? It's like, it may not be resolved. Or what mostly happens with performance also is that everything that emerges from the audience is their own to deal with, right? They're like, oh my God, I'm scared by your figures. And I'm like, well, it's not my figures, right? Like, because again, it's like somebody else may not be scared. So it brings up a lot of things within the audience. They become an active participant perpetually within performance art.
That's
Yeah.
good.
So I think so. I think so. And also, it just makes sense, I think, in the future because hopefully there's more opportunities, right? And you may not be there to activate the 15-minute performance every day.
Speaking of other opportunities, is there anything on the horizon that you want to share with us at all?
Well, you know what? I think I'm working on a solo exhibition in Baltimore in late spring in May. Is that late spring? I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, in Baltimore. That'll be wonderful. I did a residency at the Creative Alliance. I ended that this past year, and so this is my culminating exhibition. They have a wonderful space, so that is something to look forward to.
Great.
And then lots of conversations about things popping up later in the summer.
So
Yeah,
exciting.
but you know how things just kind of start to emerge and coalesce.
So you do so many different things, and I'm struck by your resourcefulness. I think I said yesterday your hustle, because you take the pieces that you have and you kind of work with the space, and then something emerges from that, and then you work with it. It's like you're weaving, How do you keep track of all of this stuff? Do you keep a notebook? How do you keep track of your ideas? Do you have scrapbooks? How do you physically work with this?
Well, you know what, and it changes. Like I remember earlier on, it was always sketchbooks like everywhere, and that was like such a record, right? And like notes and whatever. And then at a certain point, it turned to, I would always get one of those really nice portfolio books with like the little sleeves, the black ones. And for every project and then a couple of projects, I would divide it so that there was always some kind of tracker, right? And then at the end of the project, it was so cool to have all these binders. After the pandemic, so like around 2021, I'm like, ooh, where are all those new binders? It dropped off, but I kind of want to go back to that. So that was one way of keeping track. And then obviously more like pragmatically, just like following the whereabouts of the artwork. I finally, I guess 2 years ago now, I did get like a software for like even just keeping track of your own work, because it gets a little weird, like we artists are always making, and you kind of have to know where things are. And even if it's like under that pile, well, you should know that it's under that pile, And so just working through that, and even though it feels like it's a lot of work, I feel like I'm never caught up, right? So it's like, oh my God, entering everything and like maintaining it. So I feel like that's still a work in progress.
Sure.
But no one particular way. I know that some artists are like, here's my bookshelf of all the sketchbooks, and that's what your answer. Mine would be some sketchbooks, some binders, some this, yeah. But everything always somewhere, right? So like external hard drives galore, like multiple copies galore. Because when I started dealing with these unconventional practices, even a lot of these photos, I'm like, oh my God, if those were burned away somehow, I don't know how I guess my language would be the only thing that exists, right? But so you really have to have those organizational elements, whether you like it or not, or else it's just a headache.
Right.
Yeah. But that's a work in progress. I feel like that's for in the future when there's like a team, it's like, oh, you're dealing with that?
Yeah, building the Hoesy Corona archive.
Right.
Job posting to appear soon, just kidding.
Right.
All right, well, Hoesy, this was fantastic.
Oh,
thank you so much, and thank all of you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank you
good
for the
night.
questions.
I feel like we can go off the air.
Thank you to everyone at home.
Goodbye, everyone. Yeah.